on Innovation, Competitiveness, and Economic Prosperity, or CICEP as we call it for short, is really excited to present this new series of webinars in which we're going to be exploring what makes innovation ecosystems work. In the series, we'll look at university partnerships with industry, with government, and with communities. And we'll look at those partnerships from every angle and take a look at how partners build trust and cooperate to achieve shared goals. We'd like to thank Florida International University's Office of Engagement for helping us out with the webinar, providing the webinar platform, and also providing production support. And of course, we'd also like to say thanks to all of you who joined us. There's been a great response to this series, and we're really looking forward to seeing many of you for future webinars as well. I'm Jim Woodell, your host for Social Capital. I'm Assistant Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, or APLU, and I'm also the Staff Director for the Commission on Innovation. Today's program is called The New Intermediaries, Institutes for Collaboration. My guest and I will take a close look at a new kind of innovation-based economic development organization that's popping up across the U.S. These are public-private collaborations that bring universities and industry partners, and sometimes others, together under one roof. These institutes are places where collaboration is baked in and where R&D and technology development are accelerated to help a region realize economic growth. So what are these new intermediaries? Where does the idea of an institute for collaboration come from? Who gets involved? What are the incentives? How are partnerships sparked, and how do they flourish? What are the outcomes? Well, let's find out. Before I introduce my first guest, though, I'd like to invite all of you who are participating with us today to join in the conversation. All you need to do that is type your questions or your thoughts, comments into the chat window, which is right in the bottom right of your screen. Just share your thoughts, your questions with us as we go along, and we will try to address questions and bring your comments into the conversation as we go along. I'd like to say a particular hello and shout out to Appalachian State University and encourage you all to ask your questions. I got a call the other day from folks at Appalachian State, and they had a great idea. They were going to bring a bunch of people together in a room to sit and talk about the webinar before, during, and after, which I think is a great way to make use of these webinars. I encourage other people to think about it that way too. So thanks for being with us today, Appalachian State. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce my first guest. Mary Jo Waits is Director of the Economic, Human Services, and Workforce Division at the National Governors Association. At NGA, Mary Jo focuses on developing innovative policy options and promoting best practices across a range of current and emerging state issues, including economic development, innovation, workforce development, and employment and social services for youth and low-income families. Previously, Mary Jo helped author Investing in Innovation, a joint report from NGA and the Pew Center for the States. Mary Jo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So Mary Jo, you know, for the title of this webinar, I borrowed the term Institutes for Collaboration from you and the work you've done at NGA. So I was wondering if we could start out by having you talk a little bit about where that phrase comes from. What are institutes for collaboration?
Well, the concept actually comes from several sources. Part of it's by observation, and part of it's actually somebody else's term, and that Michael Porter, after I observed it and came up with the idea, Michael Porter, I found out, had already used the term. So I'll give him credit, but I'll give some others credit. If you look at slide 7, that's sort of the first concept of where it comes from, if we can get that slide up. It shows a sort of a figure of an ecosystem, and as we all know, states have been thinking about how do you do innovation-centered economic development for several decades, and most of the effort in the early days started with how do you put in place all these important components. You know, how do we build up centers of excellence at our research universities? How do we put in place programs for entrepreneurship? And that whole circle of a lot of programs, a lot of activities, but there was also a realization that we can put all these elements in place, but we're not sure they all come together in a system or an ecosystem and so that we have value and make sure there's value in terms of jobs and new industries and new opportunities in our particular state or region. So the concept was, well, who coordinates this ecosystem started to emerge. And so that was one kind of notion, and it ends up being it's probably not going to be what normally would be what a university would do. It probably wasn't going to be what a Department of Commerce was going to do. So what would it be and what would it look like? So that was one source of it, and it turns out that Michael Porter actually did say, in many ways, since innovation is such a complex process, you almost need a conductor. Sometimes these systems evolve naturally, and they usually do, like in Silicon Valley, but oftentimes you need a group of intermediaries, not just one necessarily, but it's really figuring out how to constantly integrate all these pieces. So to find the missing conductor. So that was one idea. The second source of the concept comes from slide 8. And I would give the credit here under, frankly, back in 1980s and 95, the president of Richard Atkinson, the president of University of California at San Diego, and then went on to be president of the University of California, started talking about the idea that we're going to have a different kinds of institutions. Everybody was bemoaning the loss of the key industry labs that were so important to drive innovation and commercialization. And we were going to have to start looking at new kinds of institutions that could solve really big problems at scale. They were going to have to cross the boundaries of industry and university, and then they were going to have to be very nimble and lean and collaborative. It's not like we didn't already have those institutions, but we needed a multiplier, a big multiplier. And so actually he and Governor Gray Davis in California created the idea of the California Institutes of Science and, the Institutes of Science and Innovation, and I can talk a little bit more about those, but that was kind of, when you put all those together, it was pretty clear that there was something else emerging that we need to think about in terms of economic development and how I advise governors and how they design their policies.
Great. So just to be clear, when you're saying institutions and we need a new kind of institution, we're not talking about institutions of higher ed. We're talking actually about an institution outside of universities, and that is connecting across these different entities.
Yes, correct. And if you look at slide 9, that's sort of the beginning of it. I'm not saying I have all the definitions. We've sort of been playing with what does it look like. And so these are kind of the characteristics, what makes them different. And as you will see, the third bullet there, it's sort of these are institutions that are not part of one university, but generally working at the nexus of several universities. Now, one of our examples today, Skip of Onami, works across all the universities, but we have also ICAR with Clemson University, and so they're kind of a different version in that it really is one university. But the notion was we're going to have an entity that has innovation built in from the beginning as a core mission, really thinking about who's that intermediary that's building the innovation ecosystem for a particular industry cluster, and then thinking about how do you worry about all the parts, what happens upstream so that you make sure you have what you need downstream to create economic value for a state or a region.
Yeah, so can you say more about that, Mary Jo, about so clearly the idea is that these institutes, which involve more than just universities, but with universities in particular, we're really talking about trying to get away from sort of business as usual in terms of university research and tech transfer. So how do these institutes represent something very different from the way universities think about those activities?
Right. Well, I think if I'll show, the best thing is to show by example, which we do have 2 today, but I'll start with the one back to the California Institutes for Science and Innovation. I actually, if we can go to start on slide 16, I'll show a couple of slides. This is actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about QB3. So the concept came originally, and you can see by the diagram here, most of us are familiar with these, and I happen to have the great opportunity to spend some time with Regis Kelly, who runs QB3, and it was really clear he was starting to design something new and think about it differently. And as he would say, I just made it up as I went along because I knew it had to be something different. So the first slide here, you can see there are 4 of them, but the key thing to the point, first of all, they're across three universities for the QB3 on the one I'm going to talk about. And if you look at slide 17, you get to see that we're starting to talk about problem solving at scale. Here we're talking about 20 research labs and faculty across these 3 universities. So we get a sense that we have an opportunity to solve some really big problems. And if you turn to the next slide, you start to see how the mission's different in many ways. We're worrying about scale. It's definitely looking at multidisciplinary. How do you put all these institutions together? Thinking about access. How do we make sure that industry and everybody has key access to the facilities there? And then my favorite part is really thinking about his vision, which is the vision of success through collaboration. So it's built into their DNA from their mission statement. The next slide shows, again, this whole idea of worrying about commercialization, turning it into jobs, making sure we're worrying about the scientific excellence, but we're also worrying about how do we get this to market. And the next slide shows sort of the diagram. So you've got kind of the 3 institutions there. QB3 sort of sets in the nexus of those 3 institutions and becomes the networking interface for both companies and new companies, helping create new companies. And then the next slide shows the other opportunity that we're finding as sort of emerging is this is in South San Francisco. And we're finding out that it's going to be probably the opportunity to revitalize some abandoned spaces. So this is not even on the university. It's separate from the university, but connected in all the ways that we would hope. But also really the beginning of an innovation hub there built around a particular industry or a multidisciplinary and 3 institutions. So that's kind of, you start to get the picture of how it might be different than thinking about a traditional tech transfer office that you might see in a university.
Yeah, I think the QB3 example does paint a really nice picture for how this is very different from how we're used to thinking about research and technology transfer activities. So thank you for that. And as you mentioned, we have 2 other great examples to talk about today. So with that, why don't I introduce our next guest. Skip Rung is President and Executive Director at the Oregon Nanoscience and Microtechnologies Institute, or Onami. Skip has 35 years of R&D management experience in semiconductors and integrated circuits, electronic design automation, microfluidics, and inkjet printing. And those were just the things from his bio that I actually could say and understand. So Skip, maybe you're going to have to explain some of those other things that you've got experience in. Before Onami, Skip was Director of Advanced Research for Hewlett-Packard's Imaging and Printing Technology Platforms organization in Corvallis, Oregon. So welcome, Skip. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be here. So what can I tell you, Jim?
Well, so one thing I'd like to ask you about is what you think of this idea of an institute for collaboration. You know, thinking about Mary Jo's description, do you think that's the right name, and is that what you would consider Onami to be?
Yes, I think it's a good name. The only thing missing, I think, from that slide is the role of state and regional economic development, without which we would not have been able to do anything. They provided some real money, which we then had to figure out how to use productively. But with that addition, I think the description is quite good. Our reason for involving multiple universities was a belief that in a broad horizontal area, material science and devices, no one university had critical mass and all had something to contribute. So this showed up in a number of things like a network of shared user facilities that communicate regularly with one another, as well as, in some cases, more than one university contributing to the success of a startup.
Great. Well, so it sounds like that is a fairly accurate description. You mentioned the thing about there being missing from the picture that we painted earlier, the fact that there's state money that makes this happen. And actually, Irma's asked a question about funding, and we're wondering if you could say more about where the funding does come from. Is it state money only, or is there also federal money from NSF or elsewhere?
Okay, so in Onami Inc., the 501c3 nonprofit, the vast majority of our funding comes from the state of Oregon, Business Oregon, the Economic Development Department. We have had, some Department of Commerce, Department of Energy funds. These have been small. We have had some private contracts, but our mission is to help the universities increase their research capacity and effectiveness, and above all, to support startup companies transferring university technology out or else taking advantage of university resources, help those startup companies raise their subsequent rounds of capital and deliver economic impact to the state.
So,
And so the
make
money
no
for
mistake.
that comes from all over the place. NSF for
Right.
university research has been huge. We match that sometimes. And of course, capital into companies comes from investors.
So the funding's coming from a lot of places, but we should make no mistake about the fact that this is an economic development effort, and a lot of the funding is geared toward that kind of activity.
Absolutely.
So you've talked about some of the partners and funders. Who all are involved in Onami, the institutions, the higher institutions of higher education, and others as well?
Well, the beginning of it came, from a few people. I was one. I was in the process of retiring from Hewlett Packard because I had become interested in the problem of new innovation that was going to replace jobs lost by large companies. This was back in 2001 or so. My early partners in this were the Dean of Engineering at Oregon State University and the Vice President of Research at University of Oregon, as well as the industry community that I had been part of, including Hewlett Packard, Intel, FEI Company, and others. We worked with the state government, some supportive legislators who were interested in a really effective investment in innovation-based economic development. That was proposed with kind of an industry blue ribbon committee called the Oregon Council for Knowledge and Economic Development. And the name given to the concept was Signature Research Center, so that's what we are called in Oregon, but that would be, for the purposes of this call, synonymous with Institutes of Collaboration.
Okay. And why did Onami happen, Skip? Why did Oregon think this was the right thing at the time?
Well, there had already been, since 1997, something called the Engineering and Technology Industry Council. I was actually part of it from HP, where the problem being solved was increasing degree production capacity to better match the hiring being done by the Silicon Forest group of companies in semiconductors, electronics, and other related industries. Some of us thought that the next problem was going to become innovation startups and job creation as opposed to job filling. One of the key partners in all of this was my former employer, Hewlett Packard, which donated the use of a building to Onami. It's now managed by Oregon State University, and it's where we have our office, although we continue to work with all the research universities. That was announced in the governor's office in early 2003, I think it was February, and that was quite a statement, a $25 million value donation, that there was actually somebody serious enough about this to put skin in the game. There was also a hearing that legislative session, I think this one might have been in June toward the end, where the two people I mentioned, the Dean of Engineering at OSU and the VPR at U of O, were asked by a particularly challenging state legislator if they would put their jobs on the line that this thing would work that was being proposed. And to my utter amazement, they both said they would.
Well, that's great. I mean, it sounded like not only was it the right time for Oregon, but there was just the right, in a way, it's almost like you have to have just the right mixture or combination of entities, organizations, individuals, and kind of attitudes toward this, the importance of this kind of work in order for something like this to get going.
Yes, I think that's well put.
So what have you and your colleagues at Onami accomplished so far? What are some of the big outcomes?
Okay, let me. You don't have to show this slide, but if you want, you can go to the Onami three-part model. Yeah, there we go. So one of the things we had to figure out, and it did take a year or two after we got an infusion of capital to invest in university facilities that we now have affiliated with Onami, was to figure out, okay, we got some money from the state. How can we spend it effectively? Really, the secret to our success, besides the things we described about getting started, was having some quantitative metrics that were real outcomes, not just activity metrics. And those are summarized on this slide. So there's the objective of growing technology and talent development at Oregon universities. And so there was a metric we needed to improve in federal and private awards. Our feeling, which has been borne out with results, is that we were punching below our weight. We had the potential to do much better. And so we measured across a membership of 250 research members, research activities. We set a goal to win a major center, which we did between OSU and U of O, the Center for Sustainable Materials Chemistry, funded by NSF, which has been hugely successful. 2 spin-outs, actually 3 so far, 2 of which are venture funded. The second was to make these facilities easily accessible by business, particularly startups, and a metric that doesn't quite get to the heart of it, but is quantitative and does measure pretty well the success, is the number of external clients and service revenue. That's been growing at over 50% per year for several years, and the model is being refined every month by the jointly meeting facility managers led by our marketing director. Right now that's running about $1.5 million in external service revenue across 3 facilities. And then finally, the big one, and what we're best known for, is commercialization. And this took a while to figure out, a couple of years, but we settled on a professionally managed commercialization gap fund, which is increasingly looking like an early stage investor. So the metrics there are the jobs, which of course is what legislators most want to hear about. And then the metric we like better is leverage capital investment. So I think if you go to the next slide, and that's my other one, only one of 2, and go click again, there's a build on that, with the little box in the upper left, if you'll just click forward one more. Anyway, the metric here is the companies that we've supported with grants, which are collaborative projects between university resources of some kinds. It could be tech transfer, could be a research group, could be facility, could be lab tenant space on a university campus. Anyway, we've done about 37 projects for 32 companies. They now employ well over 160 people. Most of these companies have gotten SBIRs, and most important, many of them have gotten significant capital. So if you look at the nationwide footprint, that is to say it includes a company that's now in Silicon Valley, they've raised over $170 million in leveraged money, about 90% of which is private capital. And so that's really what we're looking for, is a successful startup community associated with the research universities.
Thanks a lot, Skip. It's really interesting to see kind of how this whole community kind of builds up around this, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that. I also want to come back to this discussion of metrics, because I think it's a really important piece of the conversation. I'd like to get Fred in, but just before I introduce Fred, one more question, Skip, which is, can you share any ideas about what you've learned about what makes an Institute for Collaboration work? What are the key lessons that you've learned?
Well, let's see. There are several things. I think we had some really outstanding people, still do, at both the university leadership level. I already mentioned, the irreplaceable contributions of, Oregon State's Dean of Engineering and University of Oregon's VPR. We couldn't have done it without that. We also had, some great faculty leadership in areas of interest to us, which include microtechnology-based energy and chemical systems, and green nanotechnology, we call it, or sustainable materials. That's the subject of the NSF Center. So having leadership at the executive and faculty levels, and then something else that's worked very well is that using some seed funds from the Economic Development Administration, this was funding we got ourselves from Department of Commerce, the I6 Challenge, we started an EIR program, Entrepreneur in Residence, and that's been so successful that we're continuing it with state funds. And so it's people and leadership. So we've got it, the right people on the campuses and the right network and people to help with tech transfer and companies. We also have great partnerships with the commercialization offices at the universities. We don't duplicate what they do, and they don't duplicate what we do. We work together.
That's great. Well, thanks. I see your question, Amanda, and I do want to come back to it. But before that, I just want to introduce our third guest now. Fred Cartwright is Executive Director of the Clemson University International Center for Automotive Research, or CUICAR. Prior to joining CUICAR in 2013, Fred spent over 32 years at General Motors, including assignments in manufacturing, engineering, planning, corporate development, and mergers and acquisitions. Fred, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear. So I want to ask you the
Terrific.
same thing I asked Skip at the beginning, Fred, which is, what do you think of this phrase, Institute for Collaboration? Do you think that's the right moniker for CUICAR?
Yeah, I think it very much is the right moniker. That's really what we pride ourselves on here, and we were set up, from the very outset for that purpose. I also want to echo what Skip said, which is that an important part of that collaboration involves state and local economic development. I mean, so it's not just an academic institution, it's not just industry, but the state and local governmental communities need to be an active part of this.
Great. Can you tell us more about who some of the partners are that are involved in CUICAR?
Yeah, from the very outset, and we've been around now since about 2007. We had the birth of CUICAR came from a combination of interest on the part of the state, at least here in the state of South Carolina, the Department of Commerce, industry, which was driving this as much as anything in terms of the need they had for more talent, and then, of course, the university. Clemson had been involved in transportation and automotive technology for a long time, but those three partners came together to form what we have here today.
So the partners then, it sounded like you said that the partners came together largely for workforce needs. Is that right? I mean,
Yeah,
it
was
seems
mostly workforce related, Jim. It was, I would say, a very focused need for automotive engineers. That's a very acute problem that exists still today, probably worse than ever in the automotive community. But here in South Carolina, with BMW close by and many suppliers and other OEMs, within several hundred miles, there was a recognized need for an education that focused specifically on automotive engineering, so at a master's and PhD degree level. So that's what we established here, and we're really the only institute, the only educational program in the world that offers a master's and PhD degree in automotive engineering.
Now, are there R&D activities there as well?
Yeah, there are three parts to this, and I think I've got it in my slide there, Jim, if you can pull it up. That helps to, yeah, if you maybe go one more slide.
The first one.
There you go. Yeah, there's we have the educational element, and again, it's focused on automotive engineering. We now have about 220 students. We started with 8 5 years ago, so we've experienced significant growth through a difficult period of time economically. We also, the facility where all of this occurs also conducts a lot of research for automotive. We have a faculty of 19 now, and many of those come from the automotive industry. So we listen very intently to what the needs are for automotive and where automotive is going in general. And we have a significant investment in the facilities to test both components as well as full-size vehicles.
So education, R&D, do you want to say anything more about the other aspects?
Yeah, economic development, we have a 250-acre campus, so when CUICAR was formed, it was about a $240 million investment on the part of the government, Clemson University, and industry, and we actually developed a 250-acre campus. Because the automotive industry, especially today, is growing by leaps and bounds, this puts us in a very good position to attract companies to come here as suppliers, and as well as doing research in automotive here locally, and we have the location for that. Clemson, in fact, purchased the property to do this through 5 technology neighborhoods, and so that's what we're developing as we speak. And then the last part here is just we serve as kind of a central location for all things automotive in the South and the Southeast. So we are really a magnet venue, and by design, have facilities for hosting conferences and bringing automotive entities from all over the world to see UICAR.
Great. Now, so what would you say then, Fred, have been some of the key accomplishments of CUICAR?
Well, I think, Jim, first and foremost is the talent side of things. We have through our program, and I would still characterize CUICAR as a startup. We now have 170 graduates to date that are now working throughout the automotive industry. So that's a significant accomplishment in that that's what we started out to do, and that's going to grow considerably with the growth of the student population. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. But the other significant area is just conducting the kind of research that industry needs today. The automotive sector is such a huge challenge technically, largely driven by environmental regulations and fuel economy guidelines, which will basically require doubling fuel economy of vehicles by the year 2025. So we make sure that we listen to industry. We know where the industry is headed so that we can do the research that makes a difference for them.
That's great. So what have you learned at CUICAR then about partnerships? What have been some of the key lessons about what makes them work?
Yeah, I really like what Skip said, because I think it all really starts with people. And in all of my years at GM and putting many deals together, many partnerships together, that really has as much to do with success as anything else. You've got to have high quality people who understand the value of working together. And really that, I think for a place like CUICAR or other locations, to have people there who truly understand the party on the other side of the table is really important. So if you have faculty, for example, who have spent years in industry, they understand what industry's needs are. So very high quality talent, as well as a real focus on listening to what industry's needs, what the state and economic development communities' needs are, but more importantly, being able to translate that into action. And so we're still a relatively small state, and we're able to do that for that reason. When industry says that there's a need, then we've got the ability to react and bring money and resources to the table to make that happen.
Great. These are all. I think it's important to recognize that both of you feel that the people are really the primary thing that make the partnerships work, and but that these other elements are also important. It's very helpful. So I'd like to just kind of expand the discussion a little bit, and I definitely want to encourage the folks who are participating to share their ideas with us and questions and comments. Bring those into the conversation as well. And actually, to start with one of our participants, Amanda asked this question. I think she was asking it specifically of you, Skip, but I think any of us might be able to answer. So what Amanda said is, when you say accessible shared facilities and tools, do you mean building standalone research facilities that are open to all universities and startups associated with the Institute?
Yes,
so Skip,
I do mean that. I do mean that, but it isn't limited to building new facilities. It started by centralizing, I don't want to say repurposing, but taking, let's take the example of the analytical facilities at the University of Oregon, where capital was used to build a centralized facility for them, but they already had the business model that they called high-tech extension that made them available to all academic researchers in the state on the same cost and access terms as provided to University of Oregon faculty, and then on market rate terms to industry and startups. And the reason they did this, and their lead was followed by the other campuses because it was a good idea, was as the tools such as transmission electron microscopes were getting more expensive, no single faculty lab, or only in very rare cases, could a single faculty lab support a tool like that. To purchase it, to maintain it, you can get great discounts from companies on equipment, but they typically don't discount their service contracts, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. So if you want to operate equipment well, if you want to maintain it, if you want to build a case for replacing it, you need a different model than a faculty fiefdom for it, and that model is sharing the equipment. And so that's what we're part of. And we provide a marketing service and some limited matching funds.
Fred, does it work? Yeah, does it work similarly at CUICAR?
Yeah, Jim. When we established CUICAR, we built facilities that are used for research purposes, as extensive facilities, but also used for commercial purposes. So, you know, automotive suppliers, automotive manufacturers can come here and do come here to use these facilities. You know, it works for us, and we have to have the appropriate staff for managing that. But it works for us as well because it brings revenue into, you know, into our park, into our research park. We will also build facilities depending on the unique needs that industry have here. In fact, we continue to do that because of the international presence in the state of South Carolina, where it becomes extremely costly to ship parts overseas for test purposes and so on. And so we will accommodate specific areas of testing and validation here in order to help our industry partners.
So it sounds like there might be a range of partners as well, too, in terms of involvement. I mean, is it true, or am I understanding this right, that some folks that come are really kind of just customers or users of the facilities, while others are much, you know, there's a much stronger tie-in or relationship either around education or research? And that's for either of you, Fred or Skip.
The facilities serve all those purposes.
Yeah, go ahead. Say that again, Skip.
I was going to say the same. So
go ahead.
No, same thing as what Skip said. You know, we use it for a variety of customers. It's certainly used for our research program, but you know, it's used for just outside clients and customers as well.
Okay. So I'd like to go back actually to something we were talking about that both Skip and Fred addressed, and it is sort of the what it takes to have these partnerships happen. And I was, you know, of course, we both started with people, which I couldn't agree more that's, you know, you've got to have the right people in place in order for partnerships to work. But I guess I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Mary Jo, what about policy? I mean, it seems that policy, state policy or institutional or corporate policy play a role here somehow. And I guess I'd like for you to speak to what role does policy play, either in getting the partnerships started or keeping them going, or, you know, where does policy play a role in all of this?
Yeah, well, actually, so early on, the idea came when I think the beginning of, you know, sort of the first investments for states and attention was all about how do we build up our assets and make sure they're world class. They were paying, you know, we had a whole group of endowed professorships so that you could have star faculty. But one of the most important things, policy tools, I think, came out with a number of states started investing in research themselves as states. Not big dollars. Some were, like Ohio and maybe California, but we had other states investing dollars in research, and governors and states kind of put the money on the table, basically saying, okay, if you want this money, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So they actually, the good models like in Utah, I think in the California example, the Oregon examples, same in Arizona, it's really, okay, we're putting money on the table and we need you to use this money this way. Number one, if you want to apply for it, you need to partner with the other universities. You need to be addressing industry needs in our state, like really connecting with one of our industry clusters, either existing or emerging. You need to be much more thinking about what your metrics are in terms of contributing to the economy. And they did put money on the table, but what we found is it didn't take a lot. It just took the incentive to start saying we need you to do something different. And for governors, it ended up being, this is great, because they had been trying to get universities to change for a long time, and basically finally came to the conclusion, in my opinion, these are my words, basically saying, we don't need everything to change, we just need some to change to start with, and so let's try this. And so that's kind of what got it all started.
So policy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mary Jo.
Well, and then in the meantime, most every state has invested in capital. They've invested in incubators. So that's going on. So the key thing about these intermediaries, the job of Skip and Fred and Regis and others, they have to go connect what they're doing to the existing resources. And bring them to the table. So it's kind of that connecting role while making sure all of those things that are out there in the state, because a lot of things going on, frankly, almost every state, there's so many programs that most industry can't figure out what the heck they are or how to access them. So by making them so visible and being the broker, these intermediaries ended up bringing all these resources together to help this entity. So they're, as Skip and Fred said, they're leveraging all kinds of resources.
So it sounds like the state policy role really is to kind of say, we want there to be a sandbox, we want you to all play nice in it, and here's a little bit of money to get you going, and then basically to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Get out of the way, but also audit for results. So I think so that you can justify, continuing the investment, that it's doing some good, that you really know that.
And the other
so another role for
another
role for policy then is that monitoring one. Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead, Mary Jo.
Well, and I think the whole idea was setting these up as public-private partnership, making it really clear that the decisions being made about what the institutes do are driven by industry. And so that's kind of part of it. And so somebody else is helping make decisions about where the dollars are going. And when industry's driving it, they're generally asking for those metrics. And in fact, in Utah, the USTAR, it's really the novel thing there is the allocation of research dollars was very much, they ended up deciding to do fast, light money, as they would say. And it was basically very little administrative problems or hurdles and small dollar amounts, but with metrics along the way. And if you met your metrics, you delivered on what you were supposed to do by X date, you got more money. And so, and if you didn't do it, then they took your money away. So it's a much more stronger accountability.
Well, so let's talk about that metrics thing for a minute. Skip talked a little bit about the metrics that they use at Onami earlier. And I know Mary Jo, that we at APLU worked for a number of years to try to develop a set of measures that we've now made, we've put out there and given to our universities and said, here are some metrics that you can use in your conversations about how your institution is contributing to the economy and economic development. And the trick about those measures, I think, is that I think we came up with a good set, but what we didn't come up with were metrics that really look at outcomes. And as I was looking at Skip's metrics, I think they get toward outcomes, but I think a challenge that we all face here, and I wonder if this is different for these institutes for collaboration, is that the challenge that we kept coming up against is, well, if we talk about outcomes, the challenge is that we don't control the data for the eventual outcomes that the state legislature or whomever wants. So for us to get at outcomes data, we really have to talk about collectively working with the state government, with our industry partners, with others, to really build a metrics set that we all report on together. And that seems tricky. I mean, partly because in some cases, some of those data might be proprietary. So I'm just curious, and I'll start with you, Skip. Has the Institute, because it is automatically a collaborative place where people are coming together, is it much easier to talk about measures, especially those measures that there might be joint responsibility for achieving?
The way we do that in our 3 areas is, so we have research members, and the campuses pull the research activity, proposals, awards, expenditures, and we aggregate it. When the campuses want to announce an award, we're happy to participate in that. But anyway, we get data pulls from the campuses. For the facilities, the group meets together, and in return for our support, they provide us data on customers and revenues. We aggregate it. We don't break it out publicly by individual facility. And then on the gap fund companies, when we fund a project, we make it clear to people that we're going to ask them quarterly for what other funds have come in and how many people are employed. And there again, we aggregate it. When a company chooses to make an announcement about a funding event or opening a facility or hiring people, that's great. We're happy to help with that, but we don't insist upon it. But we do have processes, and we put some effort into it to collecting the data we need. Companies, of course, have business identification numbers, and those are provided to the state, and they can do their own aggregation of that.
Okay. How about you, Fred? How do you handle the gathering of data for your performance indicators at CUICAR?
Jim, I think that for each one of these institutes, I mean, it's a little bit unique, but due in part to where the current economic development status is of that particular state or that particular sector that it's serving. In the state of South Carolina, we're an organization and we're a state that is growing, a lot. So there's a lot of focus on economic development, a lot of focus on jobs that are created as a result of this research park. So, that's certainly a measure. But also from a research standpoint, with the kind of research that we do, much of the success is measured by the return on the investment that these manufacturers make in the research that's done here. So if they provide $500,000 of research funding to our organization, how does that directly contribute to their bottom line? And in many cases, it could be a 10-to-1 benefit to them, and so that's measured. But it depends on each, really each industry partner as well. So we measure our success based on what industry tells us in terms of the contribution that we've made. From an economic development standpoint, the number of jobs that are created, and what's emerging in South Carolina, similar to Oregon and other states in the U.S., is just how much entrepreneurial spirit and how many startup companies have we been involved in launching here. So those are some of our key metrics.
And I might just add that, to me, sort of the bottom line is, when I like to talk about ICAR, out of the 200 students you have, they all get hired by industry. I consider that a very good metric, and you could probably place more. And as I understand it, the Deep Orange, the concept of the car, all the way from concept to production, some of the partners have been interested in thinking about producing that car. So I think those are very important measures. The others would be, what I'm seeing is, if industry's not getting what they want, they're probably not going to hang around and keep putting dollars in. So that's a pretty good metric. And then finally, if you see, in many cases, whether it's in Virginia, California, I would assume in Oregon and ICAR, There's some clear links to new companies locating there because they want access to the same kind of partnership. From a governor or economic development point of view, I consider those also very important metrics to be talking about.
Those are
Here, here.
great, Mary Jo. And are any of these that Mary Jo mentioned measures that you've used in your own work at either CUICAR? I guess I'll ask you first, Fred, at CUICAR.
Well, you know, I mentioned earlier that industry looks at return on investment, and I suggested that that applies to research, but it also applies to hiring. When CUICAR was established, as an automotive engineering program, we were very explicit that the curriculum and the educational model would allow employers to get an immediate return on their investment when they hired these employees. So the experience that they get here over a 2-year period is such, through projects like Deep Orange, for example, that as soon as they hire these students, they are immediate contributors to the organization. And so we go back to our industry partners on a regular basis and see if that's working for them. And right now it is.
We're actually running out of time already, which I'm kind of shocked about. This has been great conversation, but I have 2 great questions from our participants, so I want to switch to those so that we have a few minutes to respond to them before we have to finish up for today. Rich Rosen is asking, what are some of the tools or techniques you use to monitor the progress of collaborations or monitor the meeting of needs of the various partners? And Fred, I'll start with you because you were actually just talking about that when we were talking about metrics, you were saying how important it was to kind of just be checking in with the partners to see that they were getting what they needed. And Mary Jo also alluded to this, but Fred, what do you think about that? Are there tools that you're using to measure, to monitor the relationship?
Yeah, just a couple of things, because we have over 100 partners, so we are challenged on a regular basis to make this successful. But we do that, number one, by making sure that we have the resources here, people resources, in order to, serve as a liaison with industry, over the duration of their involvement here. So, you can very easily, we had the same thing when I worked in automotive, the same issue where, if you don't tend to your important partners here, then they go away. So we have to make adequate resources available to make sure that they're getting what they need. There are all kinds of ways to measure their happiness or their satisfaction with being part of our research park. So we have a standard form and a standard way to regularly discuss with them just how successful this has been for them. And the other thing I would suggest, because we have a lot of large international companies, is we have we have steering groups that are set up, steering teams that are set up. We meet with these large corporations on a regular basis to make sure that they're getting exactly what they expected to get. So those are just 3 ways that it makes it work for us.
Yeah, I mean, somebody said earlier that listening is an important part of keeping the partnerships going, and I think that these kind of monitoring tools seem to be so important. And as you're pointing out, Fred, those monitoring tools can be all kinds of things, from just regular meetings and conversations to more formal ways perhaps to collect input from partners in terms of how things are going. I'm going to jump to the question that we have from Appalachian State, which I think is for Skip. So Skip, can you talk a little bit more about the commercialization, the GAP fund, and how much it was initially invested in that fund, and also how much is allocated per project on average?
Okay, sure. So the short answer to this is our website, onami.us, and the commercialization tab covers a lot of that. But quick answers, we've so far put about $7 million since 2006 in the fund. We've spent about 6.5. The projects are a maximum of $250,000, and we tranche them, so they don't get all the money at first, and they don't get all the money unless they meet milestones. So it's quite different from traditional academic funding. We started out making just grants, although we would allow some of the funds to be subcontracted to the beneficiary company, that is subcontracted from the university where we sent the money, in order to accomplish the tasks. We have started about a year ago taking a financial interest in several different forms. One is a share of proceeds to the university. In other cases, it's equity in the company. We've done 5 of those so far. And so we're moving in the direction of an early stage investor. So there are, some financial strings attached now. We do this on charitable terms at effectively half the cost of capital that a company would see on the open market.
Great. And I don't know, did you mention who the folks are that are eligible to apply?
Well, formally, the principal investigator of a grant is one of our members from one of the research universities, and they, in partnership with a startup company that is doing something in our areas of interest, which is broadly speaking materials and devices, that includes pharma, so we've actually funded a couple of drug discovery related projects. So it's got to be an Oregon company that intends to raise capital and grow in Oregon. They can raise the capital from anywhere, but they'll deploy it and grow in Oregon, and they have to have a connection with one of our research university partners, facilities, or research groups.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for all of that information. Hopefully, Appalachian State, you got some good information there. I want to, before we close, I just want to give you, Mary Jo, an opportunity kind of for a last word. And, one of the questions we talked about discussing was, how do universities have to change to adopt this kind of model or be part of this kind of model? And what changes about them after they get into it? And I guess the same question can be asked of industry partners. How do these institutes for collaboration change the partners that get involved, from your observations?
Well, I think everything we've said sort of characterizes it, but I think it's kind of everybody's sort of figuring out they have to engage a lot more than they ever thought they had to engage. It is truly about collaboration, and so I think ultimately it ends up being the leaders of these kinds of organizations, whether they're within the university or outside, they've really got to be proactively finding and nurturing connections across all kinds of boundaries that we've talked about. And there's just got to be the speed and flexibility in working with industry. Most of the folks who are running these organizations, the first thing they'll tell me is they went and asked industry what they needed, and first thing they would say, you got to help me move fast to access what I need. And then there's a focus on innovation that's strategically targeted for a particular industry focus. And then finally, I think we're learning that it's all about figuring out spaces that cross traditional academic boundaries. It might be a physical space, a geographical space, or it might be more the multidisciplinary kind of space. I think that's true for industry and any kind of organization now that's really focused on participating in the innovation economy. I can't imagine how any of that doesn't apply to your characteristics, or isn't a characteristic of what you are.
Or any kind of organization that's going to be involved in this kind of thing.
Correct.
Well, so thank you very, very much, Mary Jo, and thank you, Fred, and thanks, Skip, for being with me today for our inaugural webinar in this new Social Capital series. I think it was a great conversation. If you want to learn more about the Commission on Innovation, there's a couple of links there on your screen. You can visit aplu.org/SciCep. You can find us on Twitter at APLU Innovation. And there's a LinkedIn link there as well to our group on LinkedIn. And please feel free to send me an email if you have any other questions about SciCep. I'd like to encourage you to join us next time for our webinar, our next social capital webinar called Culture and Collaboration, Partnering with Entrepreneurs, and we're going to do that on May 15th. And our guests are going to be Linda Kawano from Cantu Designs, Phil Weilerstein from the National Collegiate Inventors and Innovators Alliance, and Neil Kane from the Illinois Partners and Northern Illinois University Venture Grants Program. Many of you have already signed up for that webinar, so we're looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks once again, Mary Jo, Skip, and Fred, and we'll look forward to seeing folks next time.
Thank you.
So long.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.